Okay, good evening, everyone. Congratulate yourselves first for making it here. If you traveled through all those waters, thank you very much. Yes, so good evening. Welcome to the Perez Art Museum, Miami. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education, and I would like to welcome and thank you for being here, both here at the museum and for those of you that are watching live on YouTube. For tonight's panel discussion program, Mariano Rodriguez. This exhibition reflects PAM's ongoing commitment to presenting exhibitions of work from artists across Latin America, the Caribbean, and African diaspora. And this museum, located within a city made up of diverse immigrant communities, lends a unique context for the celebration of Mariano's work. This evening's program will be introduced by curator Iberia Perez Gonzalez and features a discussion with historians, professors, and writers, Dr. Michael J. Bustamante and Dr. Carol Damian, moderated by exhibition curator, Professor Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta. Panelists will discuss artist Mariano Rodriguez's body of work from multiple perspectives that delve into the historical and art historical circumstances surrounding his work and practice. Following the panel, we encourage you to engage in a Q&A as an open forum for conversation. A few acknowledgements before we begin. I would like to thank and acknowledge the incredible team of people that work so very hard to produce our PAM education programs. Big thank yous go out to Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult and Public Programs, Janessa Melendez, Education Coordinator, and our world-class audio and visual team, Denise Faxis, Andrew Bird, and Lazaro Yanes on video and cameras. We literally could not do this without you all, so thank you. So the exhibition, Mariano Variations on a Theme, is organized by the McMullen Museum of Art, Boston College, in collaboration with the Fundación Mariano Rodriguez, with support from Boston College and the patrons and the Latin American Art Initiative of the McMullen Museum. The exhibition is also supported by Ramon Cernuda and Nercis Ganem, Karen H. Bechtel and William T. Osborne, Maria Bacelli and Scott Hodes, and the J.W. Marriott Marquis, Miami. And for that, we would like to gratefully acknowledge that support. I will now pass the mic on to Iberia Perez Gonzalez, who is the Andrew Mellon Caribbean Cultural Institute coordinator at PAM, where she has organized the immersive exhibition Carlos Cruz Diez, Chromosaturation, and PAM's iteration of Mariano Variations on a Theme. She is currently working on a film exhibition, The Ballad of Suzanne Cesar by Madeline Hunt Ehrlich, which will premiere at PAM in April 2023. Prior to joining PAM, she was a CMAP Fellow for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, where she also collaborated with the Patricia Phelps de Cisneros Research Institute. She received a PhD in art history and theory from the University of Essex in England and an MPhil in contemporary art and global perspective from Leiden University in the Netherlands. She has written for scholarly publications and exhibition catalogs and worked in various research, curatorial, and editorial platforms in Europe, the United States, and Puerto Rico. So, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Iberia Perez Gonzalez.
Thank you, Marie, for the kind introduction. For those of you who just walked in, or those that just tuned in online, I'm the coordinator of the Caribbean Cultural Institute, or the CCI, as we call it. And I also had the great pleasure of organizing Mariano's exhibition here at PAM with our former chief curator, René Morales, and working in close collaboration with the curator, Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta, who will be moderating tonight's conversation. Echoing Marie's words, thank you all for joining us tonight in presence or virtually for this event organized in conjunction with the exhibition Mariano Variations on a Theme, which is currently on view here at PAM, following a successful initial presentation at the McMullen Museum of Art in Boston last year. It is an honor for us to be able to present Mariano's first comprehensive solo exhibition here in the United States. As will be discussed during tonight's presentation, The show highlights 6 decades in the prolific artistic career of Mariano, who is regarded as one of the most important artists of the second generation of the Cuban avant-garde. I would also like to mention that this is the second exhibition organized within the framework of the Caribbean Cultural Institute, a curatorial and research initiative that initiated here at PAM in 2020, thanks to the generous support of the Mellon Foundation. Before presenting our featured speakers, I would like to acknowledge the generous support and collaboration of the Fundación Mariano Rodriguez and the collectors who kindly lent their works for this exhibition. Without your support, this exhibition would not have been possible, so thank you all. And so now I would like to make a brief announcement about the upcoming release of a book titled Mariano, 100 Masterpieces, published by Fundación Mariano Rodriguez, with contributions by Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta and renowned writers and poets like José Lezama Lima, Nicolás Guillén, Mario Benedetti, Gioconda Belli, among many others. For those interested, please feel free to scan the QR code on the slide and also in the digital screens that you can find in the store at PAM at the entrance to sign up to receive more information when the book is available. So tonight's program features Dr. Michael J. Bustamante, Dr. Carol Damian, and Professor Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta, and I'll proceed to introduce them in alphabetical order. Dr. Michael J. Bustamante is Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Morrow Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He previously served as Assistant Professor of Latin American History at Florida International University and is the author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. With Jennifer Lambe, he co-edited and contributed to The Revolution from Within, Cuba, 1959 to 1980, published by Duke University Press in 2019. And he's also a member of the editorial board of the journal Cuban Studies. Dr. Carol Damian is a professor of art history, formerly in the School of Art and Art History, and the former director and chief curator of the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum at Florida International University. She's a specialist in Latin American and Caribbean art and has recently been working with Latin American women and Cuban exile artists for whom she has written numerous essays. She is the author of The Virgin of the Andes, Art and Ritual in Colonial Cusco, published by Grassfield Press in 1995, and she has curated numerous exhibitions and is the curator of the Kislak collection of the Miami-Dade College Freedom Tower and the curator of the Chapel La Merced at Corpus Christi Church in Miami. Professor Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta taught Hispanic Studies at Boston College for over 20 years and has served as curator of its Macmillan Museum of Art since 2004. Her research interests and publications focus on the relationship among art, literature, and culture in 20th century Latin America and Spain. She has curated over 10 group shows and solo exhibitions, edited 5 catalogs, and published numerous essays on Spanish and Latin American artists. Her exhibitions have traveled to the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Long Beach Museum of Art, the Patricia and Philip Frost Museum at Florida International University, and the Museo de Filatelia in Oaxaca, Mexico. So to kickstart the conversation, we'll start by playing a short video that provides a very short and condensed summary of the exhibition Mariano, Variations on a Theme. Let's watch.
The show is about Mariano Rodriguez, and I think one of the things that you have to understand is this title, which is Variations on a Theme. Variations on a Theme is actually borrowed from music. So what is specific to Mariano is his use of different themes. And how he reinterprets these themes through different stylistic kind of motifs. So he weaves in and out of his work the same themes, reinterpreting them within these stylistic genres such as Mexican muralism or the School of Paris, abstraction, both geometric and abstract expressionism. And then we arrive at the 60s and he does something entirely new and entirely unique, which is what I have dubbed the grotesques. What we hope to bring to this exhibit here at PAM is really expose our viewers to what he did in the 50s. He entered into dialogue with New York abstraction and abstract expressionism and Latin American geometric abstraction at the beginning of that decade. I really want the guests to take away an appreciation for what a grand painter Mariano is. So I hope that those dark walls will really make his paintings sing. But I also want them to realize that he was more than just a painter of roosters. So he went beyond the rooster and he really took in other movements, other stylistic movements such as abstraction. A lot of people have never seen his abstract works. How one man, one painter, one human responds to all these different movements and challenges is there laid out in front of you. So he's a universal painting and he's painting universal themes. So come see Variations on a Theme.
So if you haven't seen the exhibition, please do. The museum is going to remain open tonight until 9, and the exhibition is going to be on view through January 22nd of 2023. And without further delay, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you so much, Iberia, for those wonderful words, and thank you for all you've done to help make this a success and your support. I also want to thank the Education Department and echo Marie Vickel's words for the AV Department and for working so closely with us. It is definitely a team effort. It takes a lot, it takes a village. So I'm very happy to be here with you guys tonight and to begin this conversation with Dr. Carol Damian and Dr. Michael Bustamante. I wanted to start by kind of referencing this title, Variations on a Theme. And two of the themes of Mariano that are quite prominent are his themes of both the women and the rooster. And this is a constant leitmotif throughout his life that we see appearing in his work. So I wanted to start the conversation tonight with an art historical perspective. And so, Carol, I'm going to start with Dr. Damian here. And you have done a lot of work with gender representation in Cuban art. And so I toss the first question to you, which are actually two very elemental questions. One of them is, why the woman? Why do we see so much of the woman represented in Mariano's work? And why the rooster? And if the rooster is just a form of experimentation for Mariano, or if it symbolizes and goes beyond that. So we'll start with those very two kind of elemental questions, because I think this is very close to the iconography of what people actually identify Mariano to paint.
Thank you. Yes, for sure. I have some slides. I'm not going to go into detail with each one of the slides, but they'll serve as background for what we're going to talk about. And this theme of woman, I think for Mariano, has a lot to do with the fact that he loved women. He had more than one wife, and he was known as being quite a charming ladies' man. So, women are part of his life, absolutely. I also think that he was very much aware of the significance of women in daily life in Cuba, that he saw them not just as a partner for himself, but he recognized the fact that for women in Cuba, they played a very important role, not only as the mother and the nurturer, but I think it becomes quite obvious, and in fact, if you look at the slide that's on the screen right now, educating, you see a mother and a child, and she is educating that child. So the mother, the educator, the foremost influence of the family is the mother, is the woman. You will also notice that she is very much a part of the land. She is, she's part of the fertility of the land, which we'll get to in a minute, but also the role that she plays is associated with the land and agriculture, a very important part of Cuba and life in Cuba. So I think that that's a really good way to start with the woman as the educator, as the mother, as the nurturer, as her association with fertility and the land. In this particular slide, you see the couple, but the theme is the same. I mean, they are part of the land. And with Mariano's paintings and his respect and regard for Cuba, the land is really important. It was an agricultural society that he is looking at, and he is also giving credit where credit is due, and that is the mother and the father. They are, the man and the woman are part of this landscape and incredibly important to what goes on in daily life. And once again, you can see they are in the land. They're not sitting above it. We don't have a background of the land. They are in the land. So I think that's very, very significant.
Can I just follow up on one aspect of that? So would you suggest that this kind of binary, this kind of dynamic between nature and human, that this is something complementary to nature and human, are one and the same, they're complementary, or they're in competition with each other in his work?
Oh, no, I think they're the same, one and the same. They're very complementary. I don't think he sees competition at all. In fact, in this slide, we introduced the rooster. So we're back to this idea of male and female, because the rooster is for sure the representation of male virility and strength and power. And so here she is with the rooster, and the rooster, she's in control of that rooster. She is not dominated by the rooster. She is in control of the rooster. So it is this interrelationship that man and woman have that is symbolized by, what is like our first introduction to the rooster and your question about the rooster. So I think they're very, very much a pair.
And he likes that idea of symmetry, doesn't he? The male-female symmetry.
Yes, absolutely. And to his credit, the respect for the woman and the fact that the woman plays such a significant role in his paintings and in his life, I think it's a very important point to make. So should we go on to?
Yeah, so when we're talking a little bit more about that, I'm also kind of interested, I think you have a slide in there about the bembes, which are these ceremonial rituals in Santeria, which is the syncretic religion mixing both Roman Catholic religion with the Yoruba religion. And so how do you think that symmetry plays out in that type of depiction in the bembes?
He also has a number of paintings that have titles that are related to Santeria and the orishas and the rituals as well. So there's no doubt that this was a part of who he was.
Right.
And although I don't consider it to be the most significant part of his work. It's not like Wilfredo Lam, where it's very important to understand Yoruba symbolism,
Right.
to understand what Wilfredo Lam is representing in his works. I don't think that's as necessary in these works.
Right. There's more of a decoding that goes on in
Absolutely.
Lam's
Absolutely. You really have to know what he is doing with it. Here, the syncretism is, it's something that we are aware of because we know so much about Cuban culture at this time and about the Yoruba and the Santeria rituals. But I like to think when somebody else looks at it who isn't familiar with it, that they don't have to see it that way.
Right.
They can see it again as nature.
Right.
And the significance of nature in his works.
I think you have a slide on the bembes, so maybe we'll bring that up. I do think it's very interesting that towards the end of the 40s is when he begins this exploration of the Santeria religious themes. I mean, early 40s, he's doing more typically Catholic, Roman Catholic religious incursions into his depictions. But then we see him, because we have a fabulous crucifix in the show. It's called Christ Between the Thieves, Christ and the Good Thief. And you know, you can come to that fabulous painting and you're just awestruck by the magnificence of the painting, and the narrative is very clear. But it's interesting that he doesn't stop there. He wants to continue to explore, and he never really goes as far as Wilfredo Lam in terms of his depictions and in terms of staying on that theme. But the religious theme is certainly one of his themes that he does explore, and it's great that it's in the bembes.
You know, it's also very interesting when you consider the titles of some of the works, that, and you must consider the period of time in which he was producing at the late 40s into the 50s, that the idea of the Afro-Cuban ritual was something that it was really kind of front and center for many artists. So he was aware of that, and he talks about the drums, and the drums that were all, you could hear the drums. And so it was that kind of an environment that must have lent itself to the work and to the inspiration for so much of the work without coming right out and saying, I'm a santero.
Right, right.
And this is what I'm doing with this.
Do you have that last slide? Because maybe for our population here, we'd like to show, this is the bembe, one of the bembe paintings that we have actually in the show here. We have two, which kind of gives us a sense of what it looks like. I don't know if you want to just talk about it for a little bit. Of course, you see the sacrifice of the rooster or the chicken here. And
looks great up there on
it does look fabulous on that screen, and it actually looks even more fabulous in person. But it's something that you were talking about, which I think is really interesting and leads me to a question I'm going to ask Dr. Bustamante, which I haven't forgotten you're here, is that we are closing out the late 40s and entering into the 50s, so we can see the evolution of this theme. And then, of course, we get to the late 50s and we get to the 60s, and it becomes much more complicated and much more, for me, interesting, because I wrote a lot about his work in the 60s, which are the grotesques. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit with you, Dr. Bustamante. But your specialty as a scholar is really modern Cuba after 1959, and kind of that intersection between art, culture, and politics. And so I wanted to turn to you and just kind of ask you, in terms of that context, what were the different ways that the Cuban intelligentsia were conceiving art, and how was that reality for them at that time, late 50s, the beginning of the revolution, and into the 60s. And if you could kind of tease that apart for us a little bit, because it's very complex, what was going on between 1959 and 1970, that I think would help contextualize a bit these paintings that we have from that period.
Sure, I'll do my best. First, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, I come at my appreciation of this exhibition not as a historian of art, but as a historian of culture and cultural politics. And so I think of artists, in fact, I know artists, right, who are not, their lives don't stop at the canvas or you know, whatever their medium is, right? They live in a social and a political world, and that's certainly true of Cuban artists of all times, right? But certainly in the 1950s and moving into the 60s, it's a very active period, to put it mildly, in terms of the political life of the country. Major transformations from a coup d'etat on the one hand in 1952 to the rise of a revolution in 1959 that, you know, would quickly turn Cuba into the global hotspot of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that we're about to, you know, celebrate the 60th anniversary of. And the role of artists in that equation is a fascinating and multi-layered story. And so when I approached this exhibition and this work, you know, I started to think about, you know, who is this man and this artist in that context? And it's a context in which, on the one hand, the arrival of the revolution in power inspires a great deal of hope at first, both, you know, across the Cuban population, who, you know, many sectors of that population have different ideas of what that sort of nebulous thing the revolution is going to be. But in terms of artists, there's also a sense, not just of political hope, but this idea of kind of a new political project that is going to give greater access to the arts in general, to, you know, common people and the masses. And I think it's significant that Mariano himself plays an important role in that process. He is not just, you know, a working artist in this period. He becomes intimately involved in the founding of important cultural institutions in revolutionary Cuba, like Casa de las Americas, where Rodriguez would work leading the visual arts sort of department there. But as I'm sure many in the audience know, the story of the relationship between art and politics in revolutionary Cuba is not a simple one. And so, you know, just a couple years later, we get this kind of parteaguas, or sort of, you know, turning point moment in the relationship between these artists and the increasingly consolidating, radicalizing power of the Cuban state, right? Which is this moment provoked by, in retrospect, a very seemingly innocent documentary film documenting people dancing in bars. PM, right, which is censored. And this provokes a really rich debate among artists that culminates in these sort of infamous sessions at the National Library in Havana with none other than Fidel Castro present, in which he issues this sort of famous dictum that to this day defines, in some sense, the relationship between art and politics in Cuba. And it's this formula, right? Within the revolution, all; against the revolution, no rights. That is both very clear in some sense, but also incredibly nebulous, right? Because who is to decide what is inside and what is outside?
Right, that's the point.
Right, and I think, you know, it's sort of how your vantage point on this infamous quote can vary based on your point of reference. If your point of reference is the cultural politics of the Soviet Union under Stalinism, this formula may seem liberatory because it's not dictating aesthetics. It's not saying your art has to be socialist realism.
Right.
So you do see a great amount of aesthetic and stylistic diversity in Cuban art, including in Mariano's work in the 1960s. But of course, there's a clear limit here, and so I think the story of art in Cuba in the 1960s is very much artists navigating this line in one way or another.
Would you say that it's a fair statement to say that, you know, this ambiguity was not only felt by the artists, but this was also something that was within the government, so that the government itself was still trying to define those parameters of what's within and what's without?
Yes, I don't think there's not a sort of a clear formula, and in the sort of trajectory of Cuban art, you know, not only in visual arts but in other fields, there's things that are works of film, painting that get produced and celebrated, and you think, how did they let that fly? Because the content seems so potentially politically problematic, or one could read something like that into it. And then sometimes the things that really cause a controversy, like that initial film I mentioned, PM, seem so innocuous by comparison to others. And so it's a kind of an unpredictable thing, but it is a little bit of a sort of Damocles, right? But I think to think about Mariano in that period, this is not somebody who was shy of his political or ideological commitments. Political art was not a central theme of his work in the 1960s. Those, I mean, you are the expert, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those, works of art like this that explicitly reference some of the kind of major political happenings of the era are few and far between. But what I think is interesting about even a painting like this that is, ostensibly about the political process that he's living, is that this is not necessarily, it's not the darkest painting I've ever seen in terms of its mood, but it's not the most overtly sort of celebratory either.
Yeah.
Right? And so, what is the kind of, I ask myself the question, where was Mariano's headspace, in terms of thinking about the world in which he's living, the positions that he's occupying, both as an artist, but also as an important figure in new institutions. How is what are his relationships to other artists who are navigating that very tricky line?
Yeah. For me, also, what's striking about this, Dr. Bustamante, is that it is painted in the style of abstract expressionism. I mean, if you took away the title, would you know what this is? And, I think that's also where Mariano kind of threads the needle with the tensions that he is feeling in terms of what is with the revolution, what is within the revolution, what is
with this one, I mean, there is a Cuban flag which you can sort of pick out.
Yes.
So you get some.
Yeah,
kind
you
of
do get the
clues,
Cuban flag.
But the abstract
what does that
expressionism
mean?
point is very interesting because, of course, there's this, sort of, it's a little bit of a cliche now, but it doesn't stop being true. The way in which, in the context of the Cold War, the U.S. government was particularly keen on abstract expressionism as a kind of a style that invoked the freedom of the free world.
Right.
And
born in New York.
And born in New York. And so there's a tension in the Cuban art world between, for a country that had such a close and tense and complicated relationship with the United States, to be still invoking things that have any kind of connection to the U.S. in the 1960s is a complicated thing. It happens, but there's a cultural tension there vis-a-vis, some of the other direction that Cuban cultural politics is being pulled, and I think would be even pulled further by the time we get to the 1970s.
And what happened, as you talk about the development in the 60s, so what is happening mid-60s? Can you tease that out for us around between 1965 and 1967?
I mean, you mean in terms of the general social picture?
For you, I'm asking for the social picture because I'm going to link it to what we have in the exhibition, which is the grotesque, which were all painted basically.
Well, these were very difficult years. I think, as even government officials would have admitted at the time. The early euphoria of the revolution is followed by this rise in conflict, this kind of ugly breakup with the United States, really difficult tension within Cuban society, the mass exodus of tens of thousands of people to this city that remade the map of this city. The economic situation in Cuba by the 1960s, the kind of initial hopes of breaking out of Cuba's reliance on agriculture, to go back to that other theme, and industrializing the country, all of that has a little bit gone by the wayside. And the relationship with the Soviet Union is becoming deeper and deeper, although it's not a relationship devoid of tension.
And how is that how is the kind of that cultural landscape with those words, how is that have been given las palabras de los intelectuales, how is that playing out? I think you have a quote from Carlos Rafael Rodriguez.
Yeah, I mean, it is still, the 60s is still a period of relative experimentation and kind of constantly pushing at the boundaries. If anyone knows the films of Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, they're deeply critical of the major problems in socialist society without sort of breaking and overtly opposing the government, which he, for example, would never do. But you see those films and you're like, how did these get made? But I have to say, as the 60s is going on, those cultural politics are hardening even more, right? The line of what is considered outside the revolution, both stylistically and in terms of content, is getting firmer, I guess to say that. Which I think makes it all the more, well, I can put up this there's an active debate about this, right? The quote is in Spanish, admittedly, but Carlos Rafael Rodriguez was an important intellectual, long-term member of Cuba's Communist Party, it must be said, who occupies important positions in the government, and in a kind of debate about, what should be the content of art, he comes down with this formula that says, well, basically, we're not going to impose aesthetics, right? As long as, it's not overtly counter-revolutionary, kind of repeating Fidel's formula. But then someone in this interesting published exchange kind of pushes back to him and is confused because they say, well, this other guy said, we should always be painting as if we were, in the middle of a fight against imperialism. But this other guy just said that you don't always have to be talking about politics and art. So there's kind of ongoing tension around this issue.
That conflict, yes, is really one that is felt by the artist, but also is being played out within the government.
Yeah, within the government or within cultural institutions that are by the very nature of the society at the time, government institutions, right? Exactly.
So I'm really interested in and I'm hoping that our guests are interested as well. So what is Mariano painting in this time period? What does it look like?
Well, I'll give one example of something that's in the exhibition that really caught my attention. It caught my attention for a couple of ways, right? For a couple of reasons, I mean. At a time when the kind of internal cultural politics are really hardening, becoming more narrow, even as certain celebrated artists have a certain amount of space and almost protection to kind of continue to push boundaries that others don't, seeing this work, which ostensibly references, a biblical theme, original sin. Again, the tone of it is dark. This is not euphoric. This is not celebrating anything per se, and so that I think is significant in and of itself. But as a historian, when I hear the words "el pecado original" and I see 1965, and this admittedly is me projecting. This is not necessarily, I can't claim that this is what it was in Mariano's head at all. But there's an infamous essay published in that very same year by none other than Ernesto Che Guevara, in which it's called it's about sort of the conception of the socialist new man and this kind of almost project of human engineering to create the new perfect socialist citizen. And one of the things that he says in there is he reflects a certain part of the government's deep suspicion of intellectual and artistic life from the beginning. He says the original sin that artists and intellectuals of our country have is that they have never been sufficiently revolutionary, which is another kind of very stark, almost sort of Damocles kind of a statement. And so when I see Mariano painting a painting titled Original Sin, is there a sense of guilt here that he's meant to convey, or is this a subtle reference even to that? I don't know. I think in terms of the broader picture of the time, I can't help but think about this work of art in relation to that infamous essay.
And, I would also say from an art historian perspective, and maybe Dr. Damian wants to weigh in here as well, but I see El Pecado Original, not general, but it's kind of a nice twist. But El Pecado Original, I see that, and I see Mariano's return to these classic themes that he was so interested, like Susana y los Muchachos, like Susana and the Elders, kind of a play on that. And so he likes to go back and retrieve these kinds of classic themes, because he is a very kind of a classic painter, right?
He's a painter's painter.
He's a painter's painter.
He's a painter's painter, and as far as the thematic thread that runs through that we sort of began this discussion with, women, and the interrelationship between man and women, he never really loses his theme of the women. I mean, all the way through, his career, there are women. And also, going back to the rooster, the same thing happens with the rooster. When you would think that he would be tired after 20 years of painting a rooster,
Yeah.
he continues to paint the rooster.
He just reinterprets it.
He
according to the
reinterprets
themes.
it, and also the rooster is an excuse to paint.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it, that
Yeah.
with all the other symbolic attributes that we can lend. Should I go back to a rooster? Do you want to see?
I think we'll, yeah, that would be great.
I think we can go back to a rooster. There's one.
There's a beautiful one.
There's this one, too.
There's this one, not so bad either.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I felt as though when I was curating this exhibition that I was seeing roosters everywhere. So even if you go back to El Pecado Original, if you go back to that stunning work, I am just really impressed with this work because of its originality. For me, you know, you see Eve, and we know it's original sin. Where is the apple? And, you know, we have all these kind of Goya-ish creatures that are flying, as you would see in air. And we have, I wonder on the right if that bird is maybe a rooster. But what is so interesting is it depicts Eve right before the act of eating the apple. So there's something seductive about this and timely in terms of, you know, instead of after eating it and biting into that apple, this is, you know, definitely a different representation of Eve.
If I can just say, I mean, going back to the painting of the rooster, I think the one you landed on was from 1941. I'm just again struck by the difference in mood, right? The rooster in 1941 is looks like a happy fellow. You know, it's a sort of a pastoral scene, right? And at a time when it wasn't uncommon either in certain parts of the Cuban art world to sort of have, I think of Cuban photography in particular in the 60s as kind of similar to the sort of pastoral images of citizens and society, everyone on board and everyone united. This is very dark, right?
This is dark.
And it's quite striking that that's, you know, what is the headspace in which this is being produced in the time when he's living? That's the question I ask myself.
Right, and that was one of the questions that I asked too. What was going on in 1965? My friend Ramon Cernuda actually gave me a wonderful book by Cabrera Infante, Guillermo Cabrera Infante. Let's see if I can remember it. El mapa de, I don't know if Ramon, you're here.
Mapa de un
De un,
espía, something
de
like
un
that, yeah.
dibujo.
Yeah.
Anyway, it talks specifically about this period, 1965 to 1967, and this kind of, you know, socioculturally speaking and politically speaking, there was definitely a pull and a division there between the people who had supported the revolution up until that time and people like Cabrera Infante, who then said in 65, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, there's a. It's not just in '65. I mean, there's different moments in that kind of history, but of an artistic fold that, and an artistic world that includes not just visual artists but writers and critics. And Cabrera Infante having played a really important role in a newspaper supplement called Lunes de Revolución in the early 1960s, which is then shut down by 1961 because it's sort of too liberal in its vision of culture and society and politics, right? So all of that is transpiring in the background here, and it's important to keep in mind.
So one of the things that we wanted to kind of highlight in this exhibition, and Dr. Bustamante will show us the next slide, which is Mozambique, also from 1965. And this is, you know, unlike Eve, which has a very seductive quality in its darkness, this has, you know, a kind of a more grotesque figuration. And this is the way that Mariano in 1965 was painting, and we have that highlighted in the exhibition. Now, there were others that were also painting grotesques. Maybe you want to speak a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly something about this. I presume here the reference is not to the country. It's to a dance and a music style that was very popular in Cuba in the early 60s.
Right.
Above all, the singer Peyo el Afrocan, who was, his kind of very drum-driven music was the sound.
We see those drums
Yeah.
here, if you can kind
Yeah.
of see it there. And Carol, you had referenced it before.
That was the soundtrack, the
bass.
popular soundtrack of the early 60s and of sort of mass rallies and this kind of notion of, as was even said at the time, una revolución con pachanga, that we are different from the Soviet Union because we're radical but we're partying. I mean, as absurd or problematic as that may sound. But again, I'm struck by the contrast here between a music style that was so sort of euphoric and happy, and celebrating, very sort of popular in its orientation and its origins, and again, a depiction of that is, one could interpret as dark or something like that. But
Which kind of harkens back actually a little bit to what you were saying about the film PM,
right,
that was
Right.
filmed by Alberto Cabrera Infante,
Right.
and caused such a controversy in 1961.
right, exactly.
Right.
But to your point about other artists working in a sort of a similar dark or grotesque themes, I mean, I always think of the work as just a point of comparison, the work of Antonio Iris, whose work was very different in many respects, but equally kind of full of these sort of phantasmagorical figures. My grandfather happened to be a friend of hers, and so his place had a number of her paintings on my walls, and as a 5-year-old, they really freaked me out. But the story of sort of what happens to Antonio Iris and the comparison with Mariano, I think, is interesting because Mariano painting in the same style has kind of a long artistic career. Antonia Iris, by 1968-69, she essentially kind of retires from painting for many, many years until the early 1990s because her work was seen as too conflictive. And so it raises this question. It goes back to the vague definition of what is considered too conflictive in this context, what's not. And honestly, sometimes the decisions seem rather arbitrary.
Right, and who can paint in that style and who cannot? I mean, undoubtedly, Mariano had influence and credibility within the regime, right? So maybe there was a little more slack given to him than it was to Antonia. Maybe there's also a question of gender, so there are...
Antonia's work is very, very different, and even though we've pointed out, and you point out in the book, in your essay, the grotesque works, there was always a subset in his work that was not grotesque.
Right.
So that is...
And all of her stuff is grotesque, all of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm
There's
sure.
also, I believe she had suffered from polio as a young person, and so there's kind of a personal story of disability in her art. So yeah, the personal circumstances and the political, I think, are intertwined.
So Dr. Damian, speaking of that, then we turn to the 70s and the 80s. Mariano painted, he painted in the 80s, and I think we have some of the last paintings in our exhibition, the last one from 1987. So he painted right up to the end. He died in 1990. But you can see this exquisite, sublime work from the 1970s. So how does he go from the grotesque, right,
Exactly.
to this fabulous kind of euphoric, sensual, sublime, peaceful, serene painting? So what is happening? What do we see happening in his art in the 70s and 80s?
Well, I think that it's not just happening in the 70s and 80s, but his work has always been classic in that respect. I always admired this work, looking at it as an art historian, but also understanding his painterly skills. And one thing that he said often when he talked about the rooster was an excuse to paint, and that we can read all kinds of things into the rooster. But he liked the iridescence of it. He liked the way it strutted around, and with every strut, it changed. So this interest in color and light and the interaction is very much the artistic and aesthetic subset that weaves through every period. So to me, it's not that surprising that we would see works like this in this period, because they were always there, and they probably remained a little bit dormant in sort of a fierce period of the preceding years where things went dark.
Yeah, in
But-
the 60s.
Yeah,
I
in
mean,
the
there was
60s.
a lot going
Exactly,
on.
there was a lot going
Yeah.
on. But it's almost like at the end of his life, he's kind of settling into who he is and what he wants to do as an artist. He wants to paint.
Yes, and you know, I do think that there was also some personal conflict that was happening in his life in the 60s, which we see he has resolved here in the 70s because this is such a serene painting. But Dr. Bustamante, what was happening in the kind of sociocultural landscape in Cuba in the 70s and 80s?
Two very different periods, I think. You know, it's striking to see a work of art as sort of bright and airy as this from that period, because just 1 year before, in 1971, there was an event, well, two major events happened in the artistic world. One was the infamous self-critique of the poet Alberto Padilla, who was arrested, and then sort of, you know, did this kind of public performance of a recanting of his work as too against the government. And that was followed shortly thereafter with something called the National Congress of Education and Culture, which most, I think, folks agree, opens a kind of particularly, perhaps the most restrictive period in terms of the ability of artists to kind of push at that line of what's within and what's without. So the years 1971 to 76 are generally considered, you know, pretty dark years in the artistic landscape, and years in which, you know, it's not a uniform story, right? This is a general kind of a trend. There's still evidence of interesting things happening, but years in which some of the most well-known Cuban writers, for example, are kind of retreating because they have no option, right? They can't publish their work. By contrast, the 1980s is an era of a lot of experimentation, of a kind of an effervescence again in the art scene, a very critically edgy art that, you know, in a context of perestroika and glasnost increasingly in the Soviet Union, and the news of that filtering in, artists are pushing at those boundaries as never before, right? And so it's interesting, you know, to put this kind of a work in context of young generations, the Volumen Uno generation in Cuba that's coming up at this time, and I think doing things that are quite different stylistically, and they are, if Mariano, as Dr. Damian was saying, was kind of settling into knowing who he is and what he wants to do, there's a new crop of artists that are coming up that are very nonconformist, and don't know who, they're figuring out who they are.
That's so interesting because, I mean, what that kind of suggests is that Mariano, if he's painting this way in the 70s when things were still dark and the Padilla affair was going on, et cetera, Mariano was really painting what he wanted to paint when he wanted to paint as a painter. I mean, I don't think, going back to your comment, I don't think that he was a sociocultural political painter. He was a painter's painter, to get back to your comment, Dr. Damian, and I think that plays out here. If we have our next slide, which is Descanso, this is a really beautiful painting that we decided to close the exhibition on. It's from 1982, Descanso, Rest, and you can kind of see the rooster, yes, of course, and the women, yes, of course. And, you know, but it's the different type of women. We see the women in the vertical foreground. We see a woman who harkens back and reflects back the retrieval of the woman as Mexico, right? With the kind of ochre skin tones, which are reminiscent of agriculture in the land, right? And then we have the woman who's reclining horizontally in the foreground there, and she's more emblematic of this serene stage that he gets to at the very end of his life. And then, of course, we see the infamous rooster. He's still making the appearance, only now, instead of having those iridescent colors that are strutting about in the 1941 rooster, we see him finessing this rooster just almost offhandedly. You know, he's just kind of producing it in a very fluid way. And then we see the sociocultural kind of nod to the people in this Massa's kind of collection over there. And then the ever-present flora and the fauna, which are Cuba, which becomes, of course, his muse in the very end. He returns to Cuba as his muse, and so this is quite a fitting, I think, last piece.
It's full circle.
Full circle.
Really
it
is
comes
full circle.
Well,
Beautiful.
speaking of full circle, I think we're going to end the discussion here because we wanted to leave a little bit of time to discuss and have questions and hopefully answers. Maybe we'll just stay with the questions. Who knows? Pose those questions. But if anybody does have a question, please let us know, and we'd be happy to attempt to give our thoughts on that.
Oh, just
Yes, I think they're going to come around with a microphone.
right there.
Thank you so much.
Is the religious content of his paintings cultural or an inner theology on his part?
Okay, so the question is the religious theme cultural, or does it go more profoundly, does it go towards the religious and the spiritual? I guess I'll take that one. I've talked to his son, Mariano Rodriguez, about this, and he said that his father was never a particularly religious man, but he did have friendships very much with priests, and the priests were, some priests specifically, were very involved with Orígenes, with literary magazines and whatnot. And so the rapport between them was very close, and also suggested that there wasn't maybe this division so much that we see in this culture between religious participation, thought, intellectual thought, and that in a spiritual way, Alejandro has suggested that his father was spiritual in his own way. And so that these friendships that he engaged in and engaged with actually helped to grow the boundaries of what he considered to be worth exploring. And so, you know, I think there was a religious and spiritual element to him in a very kind of fluid, open sense that also, you know, caused him to look at the Santeria religion, not only explore the Roman Catholic religion, but also explore the Santeria religion. And also, I think if you look at La Naranja, maybe even El Descanso, you can see a certain type of spirituality in that work as well.
Another question?
I wanted to ask a question about, because we have seen in recent years like a renewed interest in Mariano's work, and now recently his work was acquired by the National Art Gallery, and there have been other recent acquisitions. And we know that during the early 40s, he was one of the leading artists of the avant-garde in Cuba, right? But then somehow it seemed like, I'm not sure if to say that the interest languished, but there was sort of a, yeah, like, I don't know, you can tell me, but I guess that I'm trying to understand, like, how do you understand that interest, like, that led MoMA, for instance, to acquire his work in the 40s, and then later the, you know, the...
Yeah,
The-
I totally understand the question. So, you know, I would frame that question within the parameters of some sociocultural circumstances. In the 40s, Mariano was extensively traveling and living in New York. He was exhibiting at the Figo Gallery on Madison Avenue. He was very much linked to the life. He was participating and learning from a lot of the abstract expressionist artists. I mean, he would go to Klein's studio and Motherwell, and he would see how they were painting, and he has a letter which he writes to Lezama Lima, the great poet, national Cuban poet, where he says, "You may think that I'm adopting a lot of these techniques, but for now I'm just looking and observing, but I do find it to be quite interesting." So I think he was very much pulled towards New York and the abstract expressionist school, which we see manifested in his abstract expressionist paintings. And then, of course, MoMA was collecting his work. There was a fabulous exhibition that MoMA sent around the United States. It traveled, and it was the Latin American paintings in MoMA's collection. And so there was a lot of buzz, if you will, in the 40s around this painter, Mariano, with his, rooster and the, strutting about. And it was written up in the New York Times, the New York Herald, so it was quite the buzz. In the 50s, he continued to collect. And then what happened? Well, there was this, quite frankly, this cooling of relationship in the 60s between the United States and Cuba. And I think, even though MoMA collects his work, even though LACMA collects his work, even though he was shown in Brooklyn, he was shown in Chicago, and internationally, I think for the United States, once the Cuban Revolution took place, and granted, he was also painting in a style which, quite frankly, may not have been so appealing. If you look at some of these grotesques, I think we've put the more favorable ones up there. But, if you see Goya's paintings, his black paintings, his dark paintings, I was just in the Prado 2 weeks ago, and there's something that is both, grotesque means to both attract and repel at the same time. So I think there was a lot of that going on. So I think it was both circumstantial, political, cultural, but I think we've come full circle, and now, as you mentioned, the National Gallery of Art has acquired this beautiful painting from 1965, which is called Reunión en la OEA, which is Meeting in the Organization of American States, from 1965, and they have acquired it and are displaying it prominently. So, I think there is reason now to come back and reassess Mariano from a more international viewpoint and consider his work from a different perspective. I don't know if anybody else wants to take a stab at that.
Well, I think you also have to consider that it's very typical in the history of art, and especially with 20th century art movements, that they become very trendy, and that there are different groups that emerge and they take the spotlight. And then a year later, you think, what was happening then? That very important. It wasn't important anymore. So that also has to play a role in the popularity of artists. It's what is happening that a particular artist is trending. And then once he's not or she's not, then they move on to the next group.
Right.
It's very typical of contemporary culture.
Very true. Stands the test of time.
I would just add to what you said. I mean, calling it a cooling, I think, is generous, right? I mean, it's a deep freeze, right? And in all
deep freeze, yes.
And in all aspects, right? It meant that the Cuban art world was unless you really tried to kind of stay up and follow, there wasn't a great knowledge of what was happening inside Cuba, and when you got access to it, it was this a surprising thing that was developing kind of in its own patterns, right? And Cuban artists begin to interact more with folks from the Eastern Bloc, and their own points of reference change. And so that cutting off is not just a story about diplomats and trade and the Cold War. It affects this deep. To quote President William McKinley, these ties of singular intimacy that have long defined the relationship between Cuba and the United States on all planes. And so it's, the relationship between, in terms of cultural connection, is also deeply cut off for a long time.
Hi. You mentioned the connection to his work in abstract expressionism. And some of the works, like the one from the 1970s that you showed, and this one, there seems to be reference also to like Matisse and maybe Gauguin. What was his awareness of those artists?
Definitely the School of Paris and what was happening in Paris was something that affected all the artists in a particular period of time. And certainly his travels to New York, where they were very much influenced by what was going on in Paris. In fact, many of them came from Paris. So that is absolutely a part of the trajectory of development that that we see, because it's very obvious in this particular painting. You see Matisse, you see Cézanne, that Gauguin, that he appreciated what they were doing and used. I think that was very inspirational to him.
Mm-hmm. He was unable to go to Paris. He went to Mexico first in 1936 and 37. Wanted to go to Paris, but there was a little detail called the Second World War in 1940 to 1945. So instead of going to Paris, Paris rather came to him. So a lot of these exiled painters made New York their new center, their new capital of culture and artistic interest. And so he was able to examine for the first time works of art in the Metropolitan Museum that were from these artists that Dr. Damian has mentioned. So the first time he saw Cézanne was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he quotes that he was just blown away. And so that contact, even though he was removed from Paris, that contact of being able to see these painters was very strong. So he had the School of Paris in New York, and he also had the emerging nascent abstract expressionist painters that were beginning to paint in this particular movement, in this particular field, which would later become a movement closely associated with New York. So it's very interesting that in Mariano's painting, he continues to feel the influence, not of socialist realism, but of, the School of Paris, of the abstract, geometric abstraction, which we see in the 1950s, 1951. We have the Boat series where you can really see that abstraction in geometric form. And then also abstract expressionism. And he talks about being in Klein's studio and seeing him paint with gobs of black paint. And then you see black paint in his abstract expressionist paintings from the late 50s. And so that coincides perfectly with what was going on in New York. So New York was a very important place for him.
That takes us right back to painting.
It does. Do you want to have the last word?
No, I just don't want to forget that he was a painter's painter. And I think when I first started working on The Rooster a while ago for you and your program, I felt very bad about that for so long The Rooster had dominated who he was and what he represented. Oh, Mariano, right, the rooster, especially when that rooster sold for, what, $1.4 million or something.
Hold on to your roosters from
Hold on
Mariano.
to your roosters, exactly. That it lost in all of that sensational sale is the fact that he painted the rooster because he wanted to paint. And all through the various periods and the various themes, you have to appreciate the skill of being able to paint in all these different styles. That's not easy. He could have rested on his laurels and just never done anything but roosters for the rest of his life, but he didn't.
I think Dr. Damian has the last word. I think that's perfect. That's what we're trying to show in this exhibition. So I hope that you can, the gallery is still open until 9. And you can come back and visit again and again. And I hope that this conversation has helped flesh out a little bit the artist Mariano. Thank you so much.